some of what I said a couple of years ago is not really on my work on Dunhuang, but on a particular temple in central Tibet. I think these murals, they're absolutely unique, and I think most Tibetologists have a soft spot for them. So they're somewhat known, but I'm gradually moving into a new project on the contemplative traditions called Dzogchen, or the Great Perfection, that are depicted in some of these murals. So I thought this would be just a chance to kind of show you through some of these murals, and then it starts quite in a sort of grounded historical mode, but then toward the end you'll notice I start floating away as I sort of get more interpretive and speculative about how we could understand these sort of mystical contemplative practices. And kind of, I must admit, I've been influenced somewhat by psychology and psychoanalytic theory, but I won't be citing any of that. That's just lurking in the background. So let's see. So the Potala is the palace of the Dalai Lamas. Probably many of you have seen this building. It's in Tibetan restaurants and so on. Not just a ruler, but he's considered a bodhisattva, an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, who you see sometimes with thousands of arms and many heads. The idea being he's so compassionate, he sort of appears in the world in all sorts of forms and in all sorts of ways to help beings and alleviate their suffering. So the Dalai Lama is maybe one of these hands and one of these heads appearing in the world. And the Potala is considered the sort of celestial realm of Avalokiteshvara, here now built on earth by the fifth Dalai Lama. When you walk around inside, the architecture, it's a huge building with all sorts of little temples and buildings, borrowing from different styles, architectural styles, mostly Tibetan, Chinese, and Mongolian. You see some of these Chinese-style roofs. But what I want to look at today is behind the Potala. When the fifth Dalai Lama was building this for the first time in the 17th century, the workers excavated a lot of the earth just from behind the building, behind this hill that it's built on top of, and carried it up and were building up these walls. And at one point, the fifth Dalai Lama, who wrote extensive biographies and secret autobiographies and secret autobiographies, he writes in his autobiography that he had a dream during this construction project that the local spirit, or Naga, or in Tibetan, Lu, Sanskrit is Naga, and Nagas in India are generally associated with water, and they make Tibetans nervous. So he had a dream, and this Naga came to him in his dream and was complaining, saying, "You're digging up my home. This is, an insult, and you need to do something to take care of me." So he woke up and he decided that a temple needed to be built in this area. And gradually water filled in and it became a lake. Here's a picture of a Tibetan Naga to give you an idea of what they may look like. They're usually, in China, they're described usually as dragons. In India, they're often, like I said, associated with water. You often find in water tanks little depictions of them, places where you can take care of the local Naga of that water source. So they're associated with serpents. And here's kind of a Tibetan amalgam of these different images of a Naga. So anyway, the fifth Dalai Lama has his dream of this Naga spirit. After the fifth Dalai Lama passes away, he hands off the government to a regent called Desi Sangye Gyatso. And he kind of runs this new Tibetan state and also oversees the search for the next reincarnation for the sixth Dalai Lama. And in fact, Desi Sangye Gyatso did something that was a little risky. because this government was so new, and because it was based not on a family line of royalty, but on a tulku line, on a line of reincarnations, which had not been done before, he was nervous about whether people would accept the authority of this new Dalai Lama. So he actually concealed the fifth Dalai Lama's death, kept it secret, and continued to run the government, signing on the fifth Dalai Lama's behalf. And this went on for quite a number of years. And so in the meantime, he recognized and found the new sixth Dalai Lama, but kept his discovery secret, and actually put him sort of under, I mean, he was being educated, but he was held in, not house arrest, maybe is too strong, but he was held in his house down here. He was discovered down towards Bhutan. So, well, let's see here. Here's Lhasa. So down in southern Tibet, somewhere around here. The sixth Dalai Lama grew up being well educated, but really in very secret conditions and cut off from the outside world. This ended up backfiring because, first of all, when the Chinese emperor and some of the Mongolian Khans who were working politically with the Dalai Lama government discovered that they'd been tricked all these years, they didn't appreciate it, and various wars began. We won't get into that. But also, psychologically, the sixth Dalai Lama, when he was finally brought out of hiding and put on the throne, he acted out. He'd been, you know, sort of restricted his whole life. And once he came into his own, he disrobed. He, you know, gave up his monastic vows and became known for his love poetry. And he and his friends would go down into the city of Lhasa and visit the bars and have a nice time. And in fact, there are some rumors that he would bring the women he met back to this temple that he was building on an island in the middle of this lake. It was the fifth Dalai Lama who had prophesied the building of this temple, but it was the sixth Dalai Lama and Desi Sangye Gyatso together who implemented the fifth Dalai Lama's dream and built this secret temple that was sort of the retreat house of the Dalai Lamas. And the sixth Dalai Lama, being the first to actually use it, used it for other things than just meditation. There is some, I should just mention that there is some evidence that later, at the end of the 18th century, the eighth Dalai Lama did some further renovations on this Khang that I'm talking about, this Naga temple. So here's, I thought it might be nice to include an example of one of the love songs of the sixth Dalai Lama, and what's particularly interesting is it actually mentions this Khang. So I'll just read it out loud. It's not broken up very well. This is the way it copied, but then I couldn't fit it all on the slide. So anyway, here we go. Before my eyes, the light rain falls with a tinkling sound. Your shame, my consort, and your blushing face are plain to see. Unclear whose shame, but anyway. Although the river bottom is deep, the fish can be taken on an iron hook. My sweetheart's bright face hides a darkness within. No matter how you try, you can't get in. The thing about these, and I could give a whole other lecture on these love songs, is that they have sort of coded religious teachings in them. So there was some discussion, there was a lot of sort of controversy around the extent to which he had left behind his whole religious training entirely, or if he had just disrobed, given up his monastic vows, and continued to be quite involved in Buddhist practice. Probably it's true. Anyway, by mixing water and milk together, a magician can make a golden turtle. Possessing a lover's body and spirit at the same time, no magician can perform that trick. If a stallion can run free, he soon goes. If you pull on the reins, you can slow him down. If you tell your secrets to the wrong lover, or off she gallops, wild like a stallion. There are no clouds in the sky, yet a blizzard whirls on the earth below. There no shoots of grain remain. Let this blow fall on someone else's heart. It's obscure. This house has thin walls. The neighbors will interrupt us. You shameless girl, your moans are much too loud. Has the willow tree been cracked? Has the thrush been scared away? In the little palace behind the Potala, there is a god king putting on a play. Well, that's quite nice, I think. He references this building. So here's the Khang today. And they've actually now built this bridge over to the temple. In the old days, that bridge wasn't there, and you would have to take a boat. Here's a picture of such a sort of traditional Tibetan coracle with yak hide stretched over wood. So imagine, if you will, that we're traveling over, being rowed across by this fellow who brings us up to the island. And when you go inside, as you can see behind him, the building consists of 3 levels, and it's built as a 3-dimensional mandala. You're all students of Asian art, so I assume you know what a mandala is. It's sort of a 2-dimensional architectural rendering of a 3-dimensional palace. So this is, the architecture of this building follows that of a mandala quite closely. And on the 3 floors, the bottom floor consists of murals of the Buddha fields of Padmasambhava, the sort of tantric saint who is considered to have brought Buddhism to Tibet in some way. And then another Buddha field, perhaps that of the Buddha Akshobhya. Then on the 2nd floor, there's the shrine that the 5th Dalai Lama dreamt was required for propitiating this Naga, this Lu spirit. And monks from a monastery belonging to the Nyingma school outside of Lhasa would be brought in and sort of lived there and did these daily rites. And then you have the 3rd floor, which was entered originally through a trap door up a ladder. And this is where the Dalai Lamas had their secret retreat space. And it's here that you find the murals that I want to discuss. I should mention, I said that these monks that performed these rituals for the Lu belonged to the Nyingma school. One of the things that's interesting about this temple from the Tibetan perspective is that the Dalai Lamas belong to the Gelug school. There are 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism, the Gelug, Sakya, Kagyu, and Nyingma. And the Dalai Lamas belong to the Gelug school. The entire Tibetan government was run by the Gelug school. And yet, the Dalai Lamas were traditionally quite ecumenical, and in particular had a long-standing interest in the Nyingma school, which is sort of at the polar opposite of the spectrum of religious interest. The Gelugs are known for their strict observance of monastic rules and sort of serious scholarly philosophical debate, and the Nyingma are known more for living in caves and letting their hair grow out and, eyes rolling back of the head, sort of staying in silence for long periods and living in a sort of bit of a hallucinatory, visionary world. So these 2 worlds are quite apart. This is a bit of a sort of speaking in stereotypes, but still, there are many people in the Gelug side of things that look down on the Nyingma school. And even the head of the Gelug school is actually technically not the Dalai Lama, even though he was the head of the state. The head of the Gelug school tended to be more conservative and often kind of quite anti this Nyingma school. So the Dalai Lamas presented there was a tension within the Gelug school, and the Dalai Lamas have long represented this kind of ecumenical spirit. The 5th Dalai Lama actually came from a Nyingma family, and so did the 6th. So what's interesting about this secret temple stashed away behind the Potala is that it's filled with Nyingma, tantric, sort of mystical visions and paint being represented. So there are on this top floor, there are 2 kinds of practices that I think should be distinguished. One is straight-ahead tantric Buddhism, and the other is this Dzogchen, or Great Perfection. So some of these murals depict straight-ahead tantric Buddhism, by which I mean these kind of practices I don't want to spend a lot of time on, but where you imagine yourself as a Buddha sitting in the middle of a mandala palace, and you perform various rituals, and you basically start from the end point of the Buddhist path. Instead of inching your way along the path, purifying yourself through rituals and philosophical study and meditation, and eventually becoming a Buddha, this sort of skips right to the end, and you just imagine, okay, I am a Buddha, what does this feel like? And you kind of cultivate this sense of yourself as a Buddha immediately, and perform various rituals from within that state. So there are mural paintings of some of the famous tantric Mahasiddhas, the great tantric masters of Indian history, who lived in the sort of 8th through 11th centuries, which was kind of the height of tantric Buddhism. There are paintings of these practices. Here, for example, is someone performing the practice of tumo, which involves working with these channels and chakras that you hear about in sort of New Age bookstores now. But this actually comes from tantric practice, where there's a central channel that runs down the center of your body, and then there are 2 side channels that come out of your nostrils and hook into the bottom of that central channel. So they're sort of breathing practices, and the idea is ultimately to bring the breath into the central channel and undo the knots at your chakras and sort of just be able to breathe more smoothly. And then you have other practices that sort of undo the knots at the chakras. And so what's being depicted here is this tumo practice, where you do a certain manipulation of the energies and you create this heat. With the idea is the feminine aspect is at the bottom of this central channel and the masculine at the top. So it's called the wrathful woman, because you create this heat that then rises up in this blissful sensation up the central channel and actually creates heat from the body. And some scientists have studied this, and this is actually one of the things that they can actually measure. And there are stories of these meditators living in caves, barely wearing anything in the dead of winter, and all the snow for sort of 10 feet around is melted, because they just do this tumo practice all the time. This is sort of the most esoteric levels of tantric practice. And normally, you wouldn't talk about it unless you get some idiot like me up here, because these are considered highly secret practices. And in fact, the very fact that they're depicted in these murals is incredibly rare. You'll find them sometimes in esoteric texts, some drawings to give the practitioner some guidance, but that they're depicted in murals is quite unusual. And even more unusual, absolutely unique, are the depictions of these great perfection practices, which you don't see anywhere. So it's sort of interesting to think about why the 6th Dalai Lama and Desi Sangye Gyatso thought to do this. Why did they decide to depict these highly secret practices in the inner sanctum of the Dalai Lama's meditation chapel? And what I would like to suggest is that it's part of a whole shift in sort of technologies of knowledge around the Qing Empire and the rise of the Dalai Lamas. Other scholars have written about shifts that happen in Tibetan medicine and sort of pseudo-scientific developments. So, for example, Desi Sangye Gyatso, the regent who oversaw the education of the 6th Dalai Lama, is famous for having published beautiful medical paintings where they would actually do sort of autopsies and look at the inner workings, anatomy of the body, and depict it. His drawings also include pictures of embryological development from a Tibetan medical perspective, and even of plants that were used to make medicines so that you could go out and identify them. There's a great book that came out a few years ago by Janet Gyatso called On Being Human in a Tibetan World, or something like that. And she writes about these paintings and about it's one of these books that is exploring the idea of alternative modernities that are not just happening in 18th century Europe, but strangely you find sort of versions of them happening around the world at the same time. And she's just talking about the idea of empiricism and how it works alongside Buddhist faith in Buddhist texts and how they negotiate these two forms of knowledge. But so when you look at these kind of paintings that are happening in the medical world, and you also see it, by the way, in things like state rituals are suddenly becoming these large-scale rituals. The Dalai Lama government unified Tibet for the first time in 1,000 years, and they would have these state sort of spectacular rituals where the number of cushions each person is sitting on is carefully planned out, where everyone sits. It's all symbolic of the sort of state order and their places in the aristocratic system and so on. So, and for example, there were texts written about the pilgrimage route around the Potala Palace for lay pilgrims to walk. And every stone and every little shrine along the way, there's a story about it, and it's carefully sort of taken apart. So there's this real shift in sort of documenting, almost in a sort of scientific way, except that it's infused with religion still. So when you think about all this and you turn to the kinds of pictures that you see on the walls of this Lukang, you can see some sort of continuity. It's almost like, well, yes, these are the most secret practices and we need to sort of control them and make them part of the state and depict them and make sure, you know, there's extensive inscriptions describing what each one is. This is sort of the establishment of an entire world system of knowledge that the government was involved in. So these are more of these tantric practices that people do, kind of like what we would call yoga today. Okay, so those are the tantric practices, and finally now we come to these great perfection practices where you get these pictures that are very strange. You get these kind of strings of circles, necklaces, shooting stars, dark clouds, all these abstract kind of forms that these yogis are staring into the sky and looking at. So the question is, what is going on here? And this is where now I turn into the sort of more interpretive mode. Before getting into it, I want to just tell you a little story. When I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, a friend of mine's brother was an artist. And this friend said, okay, he's finished with this project. He would like us to come over, have dinner, and he'd like to show us his new art project. And I was sort of, I thought, oh God, this is not going to be very good. But okay, a free dinner. And so we went to his house, had a nice dinner, and then it turned out it was a slideshow. So we all sat there in the dark, and he started putting up slides. I don't have any of the slides, so I took this just because I thought it was interesting. It's a lake just outside of Ann Arbor, Michigan. And some of the slides looked a little like this. So what he had done was quite simple. He'd taken a circular mirror with no frame, just straight glass, and he just sort of placed it in different places in nature, in the sort of blighted post-industrial Metro Detroit countryside in the winter. So there are sort of sticks and maybe a stream and some, you know, old dead leaves, and he just started showing these slides of a mirror just in different places in nature. And I was thinking, oh God, I don't know. I don't know what this means. You know, what am I doing here? So I thought to myself, well, to pass the time, you know, I'll start entertaining myself by looking, like, where is that mirror? Because it's actually quite hard to see, right? It's sort of, there's nothing that frames it. And he just kept going through the slides. And after a while, I would sort of try to find the mirror as quickly as possible, and after a while, I started realizing what I was looking for were repeated patterns in nature. So you would look for a place where there's a stick and a leaf and then another stick and a leaf that look exactly the same, there's the mirror reflecting the stick and the leaf. That's why it's the repeated pattern. And it kept going, and it became, I started having this experience of sort of almost being rocked back on my heels, because there was so much to look at in each slide, and you're sort of looking around trying to find where the mirror is, and it's almost like my vision was becoming sort of disorganized as I sort of was just opening up, trying to find it as quickly as possible. Where are the repeated patterns? And what started happening is I would see repeated patterns and think, there's the mirror. Oh no, that's not actually the mirror, that's just actually a repeated pattern in nature. And so these patterns were sort of emerging, and then you'd see, oh, there's the mirror. So it was this strange experience of sort of feeling a little, this is sort of subtly undone, sort of confused, and yet my vision was sort of opening to patterns in nature that normally I wouldn't bother to identify, right? So it sort of transformed my whole way of seeing. So keeping this story in mind, I think actually there's something similar going on with these Dzogchen, these great perfection contemplations. So, by the way, just to add a little bit of history, these inscriptions, in the case of these Dzogchen practices, are all drawn from a text called the Kunsang Gongdu, which was a revelation discovered by someone, a master from the 15th century named Pema Lingpa, who lived down near Bhutan in southern Tibet, which is the same area where the sixth Dalai Lama was born and discovered before he was brought up to Lhasa, right? And in fact, the sixth Dalai Lama is a descendant of Pema Lingpa's brother. So he was in the same family line. So it's not entirely coincidence that this is the particular textual tradition that was being depicted on the walls of the sixth Dalai Lama's temple. Anyway, so the idea with these practices, which are very much about vision and opening your vision and finding new ways of seeing, is a little counterintuitive for us moderns. We tend to think that light comes from the images we're looking at, hits our eye, the retina, and goes into our brain, and we see them, right? But for them, they believe that it is at least as true, if not more true, that the light that we see around us is actually coming from within us, and that all of this is a projection that's coming out of our heart. In these traditions, your mind is not here. This runs your body, but your mind is stored here, and it comes out of your mind and out through the eyes, and you project all of this. In fact, ultimately, philosophically, they say that the whole point is to break down the duality between inside and outside, between subject and object. And this is part of how they do it, is they say that everything we experience around us is a projection of what's happening within us. It's like a dream. So, how do they go about integrating these insights? There are two main approaches to great perfection contemplation. One is the dark retreat, and the other is during daytime, gazing at the sky or light rays. The dark retreat is typically done for 7 weeks, which is the amount of time your thought in this tradition that is held to pass after you die, but before you take rebirth. It's this bardo period that the Tibetan Book of the Dead talks about, the last 7 weeks. Sometimes people will do an abbreviated dark retreat for just 7 days. But there's no question there's some idea that you're going into this sort of realm of the dead with no light. They completely cut off all light for the entire period of 7 weeks. And you enter this visionary journey that's likened to the journey of the bardo between death and rebirth. So this is a place, a Nyingma nunnery, just north of Lhasa that I visited once, and there's a cave with a temple built up above the nunnery. And I was walking up, actually with Janet Gupta, who wrote that book I just mentioned, and we came by some houses along the way, and I saw this little window, and I asked one of the nuns, well, what's this? There was the only window in this small stone hut. And she said, well, that's a dark retreat hut. There's someone in there doing a dark retreat, and that we have a double window where we can put the food in and then close the window, and then they open it and take the food out. I thought that was kind of interesting. So what happens when you go into this dark retreat? There's actually a nice book by a philosopher who teaches at Northwestern University called David Michael Levin, where he writes a diary of, he's a Western-trained philosopher, phenomenologist, but he decided to try a dark retreat. He's sort of thinking about vision and so on and wanted to try one out. And he talks about how for the first few days, he spends the whole time, you know, as you surely have experienced, when you're in absolute darkness, it's not actually just completely black, right? There's sort of red sparkles and blue sparkles and sort of cloudy shapes, sort of as you're trying, and your eye, and he describes this and describes how his eyes are trying to sort of make sense of what's happening and sort of latching onto these things, and then they kind of morph and move, and over the days, his eyes are just getting exhausted from these attempts at sort of making sense of this, what is really just total darkness. And after 2 or 3 days, he starts having these sort of searing headaches, and his eyes are just sort of aching in their sockets. And finally, I think it was on the 4th or 5th day, he had this experience where his eyes just kind of gave up. And the headaches went away, and his eyeballs, the musculature of his eyeballs just kind of gave up and settled. And from this moment on, he started having these visions that would just pop right in front of him, absolutely colorful and bright, and then pop away. So here's a traditional account of a dark retreat from a 13th century author, Tibetan author. The visions tumble like water down a cliff face, or like mercury scattering and beating together. They are unstable, arising and ceasing, scattering and regathering, shaking and quivering. Inwardly, one's experience of concentration is weak and fleeting. And as the visions wax and wane, doubts arise. This feeling of sort of anxiety at being unable to control your visual field. So this event of your eyes giving up and then these visions appearing is actually scientifically documented. It's called the Charles Bonnet syndrome, or otherwise known as the visual release hallucinations. And scientists have tried this, locking people in the darkness for long periods of time, or even blind people sometimes have these very vivid visions. It was Charles Bonnet's grandfather who was having these visions, and Bonnet described them for the first time. So there's something about how the eyes become kind of disorganized, I would say in a similar way to what happened to me in a small scale way when I was looking at these slides, right? The eyes kind of are straining to make sense of things and then kind of give up. And then new patterns or new visions kind of emerge, almost projected out of the unconscious or something. So that's the dark retreat. The main practice is actually one of what you might call sky gazing, and here you have people doing this practice. And mostly they describe just looking at clear blue sky. Sometimes they talk about looking at the rays. You shouldn't look into the sun, obviously, but off of a light or of a lamp or a sun that's sort of off askew, you can see the rays. And what they say, this one actually says, look sort of half off the sun. And what they're focusing on for these practices, it's almost like the yeast or something that then the practice develops out of, are these things. These are called the vajra, or the sort of adamantine, diamond linked chains of lambs, the little chains. And the tradition would balk at what I'm about to say because it's too mundane, and they prefer to talk about it in much more transcendental terms as the building blocks of our awareness, our mind coming out through our eyes. But what we would call them, frankly, is floaters. You know how when you see these, especially when you squint and you look at the light rays and you can see these little balls in a string and another little knot in the string, and what they are is sort of clumps in the goo of your eyeball. And what's sort of frustrating and fun to play with is, of course, when you try to look at them, because they're part of your eyeball, they slide. You know, the faster you try to look at them, the faster they move. You can never get a good look at them, right? And so this is sort of traditional and sort of not traditional, but I would argue that the reason these are such a powerful place to focus one's attention is precisely because they are both subject and object, right? They are part of oneself. They are part of the subject's physical self. And yet they're being seen as if they were an object outside of your body, right? Floating in the sky in front of you. And if you try to objectify them, if you try to look at them in the normal way that you'd look at any object and be able to pin it down with your eyes and look at it, it evades your attempt. And the only way to get it to settle down and really look at them is to stop looking at them, is somehow to open your vision and stop trying to cling on to them and just kind of broaden your sense of seeing so that you can sort of see them. You're paying more attention to the peripheries of your visual sphere, yeah? And then as your eyes sort of settle and stop trying to grab a hold of everything, you can actually, it's almost like you can see them without looking at them. You're learning a new way of seeing without looking is basically what's happening. And so through this practice of staring at the sky or light rays, your vision starts to open. And as it opens, and you stop locking into what is important. I am speaking to a person, this is what is important, the background is just nonsense, or this is the computer, the rest is separate, so I'm going to just conceptualize this. You let go of all that, and you start to open up to what's actually happening in your visual sphere. And you start realizing there's a lot going on. There's all these bings and whistles and shooting stars and strange abstract patterns that start to emerge and flourish as you kind of let go and open up your vision. I think it's a little like when you look at, you know how when you look at into the eyes of a newborn baby, and it's clear that they're just kind of seeing a wash of color, you know, like they haven't yet locked into like, oh, this is something and that's not something. It's just sort of, so, and then since that time, all of us have been trained since birth to start dividing up our visual field, yeah? And start to say, oh, this is an object, that's not the object, and this is where I draw the boundary, and so, all of this like buzzes and whistles and strange things are irrelevant to what we're trying to conceptualize here. They're just peripheral junk on the sides of our visual experience, yeah? And what this practice is doing in some ways is undoing all of our habituation, going back to a sort of baby-like way of just looking at what's actually happening in our visual sphere and not distinguishing between what is real and what is just goo in my eyeball, not distinguishing between what is real and what is a hallucination or a wishful thinking or an imagination or something. The whole point is, as soon as you conceptualize that, it all freezes up or evades your vision. And the point is to sort of stop asking these questions. And what's interesting is the extent to which they're doing conceptual meditations or non-conceptual. They're sort of undoing conceptuality, but they're doing it not just as a mental meditation, but they're working with the ways in which conceptuality has been inscribed into the musculature of our bodies. So they're undoing our conceptuality in our bodies, if you see what I mean. And that's why David Michael Levin was talking about having these headaches and so on. Like his habituation to conceptualizing and being able to control his experience was failing him, and his body was starting to freak out. His muscles were just exhausting themselves, trying vainly to control things. Here's a close-up of one of these floaters. What's interesting about this practice in this sense is that it's kind of trying to strike a balance between stability and movement. So for example, this is a picture of someone meditating on water. You stare at a river or a waterfall or something. And what you're trying to do in some sense is find the still point that is part of the movement, or somehow keep your, it's you know, if you look at a waterfall, it's quite hard to keep your eyes still. You start following little bits of water to actually just sort of open your vision and allow the water just to flow through. And what's interesting here again is that you're sort of undoing your normal habits of seeing, of grabbing hold of things, and finding a stability within movement and allowing movement to flow through your vision without following it, kind of thing. And this is generally looking at water. They do all sorts of senses. They do hearing, they do physical. They'll take a rock and they'll just kind of go like this. And the different senses, seeing, hearing, touch, they're kind of working with the senses and trying to find this sort of stable point within movement. And that sort of is all preparing you for this sky-gazing practice. So what happens in the dark retreat, what happens as your eyes open up and sort of give up, you start having these, I mean, today's cynical Western psychologist would say your unconscious starts filling in the space, just like our unconscious does every night when we fall asleep. We start dreaming, right? It's almost like our minds can't handle nothing, so we just create things. And we have these very bright, vivid visions that seem realer than real. And sure enough, what they say happens is that by sort of focusing or not focusing on these floaters and yet focusing on them in some way, gradually what happens, there are a few other experiences in the visual sphere that they focus on. There are these strange balls of concentric circles, and they say that those start to develop into rainbow-like spheres. And somehow, and this is where it gets a little vague, because there's an oral tradition that accompanies this that's all very secret, and you're supposed to be working one-on-one with your teacher, but somehow basically the patterns that are or the experiences that are emerging start to take on patterns, new patterns are revealed, and gradually they emerge into sort of more familiar forms. Whether this is the Buddha speaking or our unconscious speaking is unclear, but the whole point is you don't think about that. This is both the Buddha speaking and your unconscious speaking. You are a Buddha, and the Buddha is outside of you, and it's only as long as you don't ask those kinds of questions that the visions will continue to flourish. The Buddhas will only speak to you as long as you don't ask whether they're Buddhas or not, in a sense. So gradually, you start to see peacock feathers, these sort of like gas on water, the sort of shimmery part of the peacock feather, and other objects, like what David Michael Levin saw, appearing within these spheres, and then the sphere starts to break apart into 5 Buddha families, and finally you have these mandalas, full-blown mandalas that appear. In Tantric Buddhism, you can stay in retreat for years, carefully developing your power of visualization, carefully constructing an entire imagined mandala palace and yourself within it. And only then, after you can imagine it as if it were as real as us sitting in this room, then you're ready to perform the tantric practice proper. In this tradition, this great perfection tradition, you undo your patterns of seeing until finally your unconscious it's almost like it's spontaneous, it's effortless. The mandala just appears. And yes, we skeptical Westerners would say, well, they're just seeing what they want to see. But again, the point is, yes and no. I mean, the point is you don't ask those kind of questions. You're sort of freeing your unconscious, or maybe your Buddha within, to express itself without clinging on to it. And by the way, I mentioned that the texts that the texts that are drawn upon for these inscriptions were a revelation. What they say happens, there's an entire technology of revelation in this school that's very much tied to this great perfection tradition, so that this practice almost becomes like a way of releasing your creativity. And they will start to sing songs spontaneously, or even read text written in the sky, and this becomes a way of sort of authoring new writings, where you've sort of gotten rid of your conceptual inhibitions and apparatus, and somehow your unconscious you're just speaking straight out of your own Buddha nature. And these are considered very sacred, revelatory scripture. Terma, or treasure texts. So connected with these practices, as you're doing them, you might hit some obstacles. You might find that the visions stop developing. They start flourishing, and then they start congealing into certain patterns. But you may get stuck at certain points. And of course, you're doing this in close consultation with your teacher. You may go to your teacher and say, "Well, I'm getting some cross hatches over there and a bubble there, but it's not changing anymore." And he'll say, "Oh, well, there's something inside your body. This tantric system of chakras is also at work here." And they'll say, like, your breath is probably stuck right here, so you need to get in a certain yoga pose that will kind of open that area up, and then continue doing the practice, and it will kind of release the breath and the energies a little more. So you get different, not exactly yoga poses, but poses that kind of yoga poses that open up different parts of your body and allow the light or the breath or the visions to start to flow more freely. All right, I was told I should take a break at about 11:20.